You're listening to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.
Small business owners and farmers are protesting the Korean
WTO and NAFTA are transnational forms of autocratic governance
Few
that
moments either
subordinate
side
our
in North American free trade agreement.
Seattle has never seen anything like it.
Mexican workers face threats of violence.
Has delivered one punch in the gut after another.
Welcome back to Rethinking Trade, where we don't just talk about trade policy, we fight to change it. I'm Ryan, and I'm joined once again by our in-house trade expert, Lori Wallach. Lori, back at the beginning of the year, Trump was making a big deal out of what he called his Phase 1 trade deal with China. He made perhaps an even bigger deal out of what would follow, Phase 2. But Phase 2 is pretty much MIA right now. Let's talk a bit about this deal, and maybe you can help us figure out what the hell happened to Phase 2.
So China trade obviously has been a big deal in the last couple of years, and there are two different things going on. There are the tariffs that were put in place to try and counteract China's subsidies and their misalignment to the value of their currencies, all of which basically are ways in which China, the government, working very closely with the companies, some of the companies are owned by the government or the military, figures out ways to be able to make sure that goods sent to the U.S. actually are priced at below what they really cost to make. Meanwhile, they come up with ways to make sure that goods sent from the U.S. to China become too expensive to be competitive. This boils down to what some people call trade cheating, and there are lots of different ways to go about it. So those tariffs that got put in place were under just regular old U.S. trade law, domestic law, a thing called Section 301 of the Trade Act. And that basically allows tariffs to be put in place to counter the subsidies another country is using. So to some degree, doing that domestically was leverage, ostensibly, to then set up a negotiation to get China to change the underlying policies that create those subsidies that require those counterbalancing tariffs to make the goods, when they come here, fair. So over time, basically what happened is we're not paying extra tariffs every time the goods come here. It just becomes too expensive for Chinese goods to come here. So China stops sending goods here. That's when you can negotiate, usually, to get a change to the policy. In this instance, though, the Phase 1 deal, instead of dealing with the things that ostensibly those tariffs were supposed to be countering, like slave labor and forced labor and cheating on currency values to make the Chinese currency artificially lower so the products are cheaper than they really are, or just good old government subsidies paying companies, none of that stuff was actually covered in Phase 1. Instead, Phase 1 actually had stuff in it that makes it easier to offshore U.S. jobs and investment to China. So Phase 1 had things like Wall Street has new rights to invest in China in new sectors. How is it a good idea to make it easier for dollars to go to China to create jobs there? Or Phase 1 had China agreeing to stricter protections of intellectual property rules, which seems kind of counterintuitive in the sense that the U.S. is a good place to invest because basic rights and the rule of law operate. So somehow making it easier for companies to be able to have their cutting edge designs and technologies protected if they're made in China. I'm still not clear about why that's a good thing for U.S. workers. It all boils down to it's not. So Phase 1 was what China was willing to do, and that's in part because it was in China's interest. It's things that can help China get more money to invest in monopolizing what it sees as industries of the future. And they have a plan for that called China 2025. So Phase 1 really didn't get a lot of love in Congress from Democrats, and certainly didn't get anything from unions because it basically was against the interest of workers. So then we heard, well, that's all that China would agree to do. No doubt, some of that they were doing without us telling them that we wanted them to. It's in their interest. So Phase 2 was supposed to be the real stuff, the hard stuff, labor rights and keeping out forced labor goods made by Uyghurs and dealing with the currency manipulations that make it very hard for U.S. exports to get into China and have their goods dumped here. And very importantly, it was supposed to be disciplines on subsidies. That's the stuff that would have made a difference for working people here. But that never happened. And now it looks like it never will.
Speaking of things never happening, before we get too much into phase 2, I wanted to go back to phase 1 real quick. And how much of phase 1 actually happened? What did and didn't happen in that window? And, is this something that was just sold to the public, or were there real changes going on in the background there?
So there were 2 levels to phase 1. One was things China ostensibly was going to do to change their policies. And a bunch of those things were things China wanted to do anyway. They were going to make it easier for US dollar investment to happen in China because they wanted the money to create more jobs in China. China was going to say they were going to protect intellectual property better because they wanted US companies to relocate their production there and bring their technology there. So those were policy shifts China was making. Whether they get enforced is a different matter. The sort of meat and potatoes part of phase 1 was supposed to be agreements by the Chinese government to purchase specific amounts of more US goods. And that in itself was really kind of bullshit, because having one-time purchase agreements of I will buy more stuff over the next 2 years in no way fixes our China trade problem. That's just useful for Trump to say, oh, look, I got China to buy some stuff before the election. But even as narrow as that was as an idea, those sales haven't happened. So there were specific requirements to buy more US agricultural exports. That is maybe at 30% of the level of what would be necessary to meet that commitment. There were promises to buy more US liquid natural gas, separate from the environmental disaster that plan is. That has not come to fruition. So the meat and potatoes part ended up with basically some potato peels and a couple of bones. It was not as narrow as that would have been the we're selling a lot of stuff outcome that they promised. And the policy stuff was stuff China was largely doing, but it's against our interest. It promotes outsourcing. So that's the whole current picture of how so-called phase 1 has come to pass.
And that would be a good time to bring up the question of the day, which is, where is phase 2? Does it exist, or is this just another one of Trump's broken promises to U.S. workers?
There is no phase 2 China trade negotiation. There will not be a phase 2 China trade deal. I mean, for one thing, there's only a limited amount of time before the end of this president's term. We can't presuppose the outcome of the election, but looking at the state of the relationship between the US and China, there are not even conversations about the prospect of a second phase deal, but also there is, I would say, it is more likely that Donald Trump is going to get us back into the Paris Climate Treaty than there is going to be a phase 2 deal under the Trump administration with China, which is to say, fat chance.
So, sounds like phase 2 is probably not happening. Does that matter? What's the significance of it not happening?
You bet it matters. That was all the stuff that was supposed to help U.S. workers and U.S. small businesses. So phase 1 was, what the big banks wanted, what the biotech companies wanted, what pharma wanted. Phase 2 was all the stuff that really was supposed to make a difference to try and stop the floods of subsidized imported Chinese goods that are wiping out U.S. production, but also, ostensibly how investment decisions are made has to do with where companies think that they can export from and what the import competition is going to be. So if you don't actually fix those underlying structural issues in China, you either need to change those or you need to figure out how to actually just stop some of that Chinese stuff from coming in if it's going to be unfairly subsidized. And phase 2 was all of that. It was all the stuff that really mattered. So it is right now really only the tariffs that are keeping us from having an ever bigger Chinese trade deficit. And if you don't fix the underlying problems, you're not going to actually create the kinds of trade relationship between the US and China that actually would put people first.
We've said this many times on the show, but we do need a new progressive approach to China that centers labor, human and environmental rights. above the multinational corporation and authoritarian government collusion that we have now. After November, we're going to have to carve that path regardless of who wins. In closing, maybe you could just give a snapshot of what this could look like and what kinds of policy changes it might entail.
So the good news is that there are now 30% tariffs on $350 billion worth of Chinese goods as the background. And that's the Section 301 tariffs. It was painful to get there. A lot of people could argue with the way in which it was done, but the reality is that's the new normal. And that creates a lot of leverage. That leverage basically has shifted the trade deficit with China. Now, it hasn't fixed our trade problem, but it's brought down the bilateral deficit. So now the trade's shifting to other countries. So you need a broader trade policy that actually deals with the same issues, cheating on currency, subsidies in other countries. But I would say with respect to China, there are two things to think of going forward, especially because you have that leverage from those tariffs. One, are there any ways in which the US and China actually can negotiate on some rules that are kind of the phase 2 menu of fixes? I'm skeptical about it, but it's worth trying. And the way to try it is actually to up the leverage. So we've got that leverage from those tariffs. But the thing is, we may be the biggest import market, but we're not the only import market. So we need other partners in Europe and Japan and Canada and Australia, et cetera, to join us in shutting down the markets available to China if it continues its current practices. The reason why our tariff regime has helped bring down the bilateral deficit, but hasn't helped change China's practices, is because the current practices can continue and there's still other places the goods made in that cheating way can continue to go. So yes, there is a negotiation strategy, but I think also there's just got to be a recognition that to some degree, unless the pain level gets a lot higher, for the Chinese government, maintaining their status quo is something they're going to not change unless, given from their perspective, changing it would be painful, but the pain of not doing so gets a lot higher. So then you get to, so what the hell do we do? And we have a lot of capacity domestically that has not been used. So for instance, with respect to labor rights and human rights and environmental rights, under existing law right now, we could be shutting down imports from, for instance, we could have, under existing law, we could have a ban on imports of all goods connected to the Uyghur slave labor camps and to goods suspected to be made by people in forced labor in China. And you basically could, as a president, put that in place under existing authority Congress is delegated by statute. Or, for instance, we could right now ban Chinese firms from listing on the US stock markets. Effectively do that by requiring them to actually provide all the information that US firms must provide about who owns the firm and what the investment status is, all things that a lot of the government-owned or People's Liberation Army military-owned firms will not make public. So that basically we're not having our stock market fuel investment that is unfair and against US workers. With respect to specific sectors of the economy, we also have a lot of laws that let us put up countervailing measures against what is effectively subsidizing goods by dumping toxins and undermining environmental standards. So not only can you just keep stuff out for human and labor rights violations, but you can basically sanction countries for importing goods that either violate multilateral environmental agreements or that are like subsidized by matter of dumping their toxics and polluting. So these are all tools that a new president has that the old president has had and not used. And those tools using domestic law are going to have to be an important part of dealing with China. And then finally, we need to actually, through existing domestic law or through improved domestic law, deal with the currency issues. So right now, China is holding on to so many US dollars in their reserves that even if they're not actively intervening in currency markets to bring down the value of their currency, they're holding up the value of the US dollar to a place where our exports aren't competitive. So this all sounds quite wonky and confusing and down in the weeds. The cut to the chase on this whole question is, We have international tools, we have domestic tools. A lot of what's going to happen is going to happen domestically. And there are going to be a lot of bumps in the road along the way that folks are just going to have to hitch up their seatbelts and go for the ride.
Rethinking Trade is produced by Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. I would encourage you to visit rethinktrade.org as well as tradewatch.org to educate yourself and to find out how you can get involved in the work we're doing to fight for fairer and more equitable trade policies.